out of respect for everyone's time, and because I know that we're running about 15 minutes behind, I want to just get this webinar started and we can let people in as they go. Again, good morning, everyone. My name is Beth Albach. I am the Assistant Program Manager for the Southeast Pennsylvania Apex Accelerator, formerly known as PTAC. And I want to thank you for joining today's webinar, which is Proposal Adequacy in Government Contracting. A few housekeeping rules before we get started. If we could please keep our mics off during this presentation. If you have a question during the presentation that you don't, you may either raise your hand or you can put them in the chat to be answered at the end of the seminar, the webinar. And just so that you are all aware, this will be recorded and available for public view. And so we are aware. I am going to now, again, we will be posting the link for this recorded webinar on our YouTube page, which we will put the link to that into the chat after the end of the webinar. And additionally, we'll be providing a copy of all today's slides sent via the email that you used to register. We are fortunate today to have Mr. Adam Weir as an expert guide to today's session. Mr. Weir is an acting small business program manager, is located at the DCAA headquarters in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. In this capacity, he serves as a program manager and audit expert for small business programs with the responsibility to provide assistance, consultation, and internal control with regard to audit requirements and their applications to small business. Mr. Weir graduated from the University of Texas at Arlington and is certified in auditing and contracting. And he has an extensive government career history, serving as senior auditor for DCAA, cost priced analyst, and then corporate divisional administrative contracting officer for Defense Contract Management Agency. And additionally, he went on to serve as a grants officer for the DLA, supporting PTAC, and also serving as a procurement contracting officer and administrative contracting officer with the Washington headquarters services. Mr. Weir has thoroughly enjoyed his time supporting, communicating with, training, and advocating for small businesses across his various roles with the federal government. I am going to turn this webinar over to Adam, and he is going to go through discussing the finer points of proposal adequacy in government contracting. And okay, Adam, I'm going to stop screen sharing and you may take it away.
Okay, let me see. Can you see my slides?
We can.
Okay.
Again, thank you all for bearing with us as we, manage our technology issues. Sometimes it's not as friendly as we wish.
Okay, so you can see my screen, but you, Beth, you were not able to see me, correct?
I am not able to see you, but I can see your screen, yes.
Okay, so I don't know why my video is open. So anyway, I'm not sure what's going on with the technology, but I'll go ahead and take it off anyway. So no, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for having me today. I'm not too familiar with everyone that's going to be joining and everyone's background and what they know or don't know about DCAA. So just real quickly, I know we're getting a little bit of a late start due to some of the technological issues this morning, but just go through real brief kind of a background about DCAA and kind of what we do. So for those who know or don't know, obviously, it stands for Defense Contract Audit Agency. So really, the contract part of that acronym is very important, and then also the audit part as well. And obviously we work in the Department of Defense. So with those key things, you have to think of it in terms of not an audit like you think of, okay, you're going to get your company's financial statements audited to kind of be, okay, were those an accurate representation of your company's, cost, finances, et cetera, disclosure statements, that you would give to, an auditor that, or rather, let me say financial statements, right, that you would give to an auditor to say, hey, are these accurate representations of my company? We really don't focus on stuff of that nature. It's contract audits, right? So there's businesses out there, I'm sure there's a lot on the line today that want to try and do business with the government, the Department of Defense. We're federal. Obviously, you may try to go after state and local awards as well. And some of this can be applicable and help to make, the kind of the topic we're going to talk about today is proposal adequacy. But my role kind of in this aspect is, we at DCAA try to make the process, more transparent. Like, what are you going to get involved in if an audit comes your way, and what can you expect, right? So, but this is a little bit of the overview. With that focus, let me see here. Why is my? Can you still hear me, Beth?
I still can. Yes, Adam.
Screen is not moving.
I'm so sorry. This is just, oh, there we go. You moved.
Here we go. Okay. I don't know if it's gonna, I don't know if it's gonna move again or not, but I hit the button 10 times. Okay, so just a little bit about the overview for those that don't know. Basically, the DCAA audit organization was established in 1965. There was a lot of, the government tries to do this when they recognize maybe they can make something more efficient. There's you have the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, all the different commands within the Department of Defense. And back many years ago, they had their own audit functions. And so there was a general out there that said, hey, can we make this process more efficient? Let's stand up one audit agency to support all those different major components so we're more consistent with the criteria. I mean, if you think about it in that regard, if you're a company, right, and you go and you do your registration with SAM and you're trying to get an award, and if all the functions were broken up, now all of a sudden you're trying to do business with the Army, and maybe they have a completely different way of looking at your proposal, looking at the records of what they need to determine a fair and reasonable price versus the Navy. And so everything was really inconsistent. And so this kind of brought about consistency to one audit organization. It's kind of the same way with FAR Part 42, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, and DCMA, who's the management. They do contract administration, and that is one organization to provide a lot of the administration out there that goes on in the contracts, because again, it's the consistency instead of everyone treating something different. So it kind of makes sense when you think about it from that perspective. And then I want to say some of these slides are, it's moving now, good. Some of these slides, I think they're just slightly out of date, but I will say in FY22, because we released a report, we examined $409 billion in contract costs. So over that time too, we issued 2,500 audit reports, and we identified about $3 billion in net savings. So that's kind of, we have a voluminous footprint to provide overview and oversight, especially to larger awards, and we'll get into that a little bit in the next set of slides. But basically, that's our capability to high quality audits to support the commands by providing our expert financial services, right? So, and you're going to hear the term fair and reasonable several times throughout this presentation. And basically what that, any sort of contracting officer that actually is going to make the award to you, because they're the only ones that can actually award contracts by law. And so basically they have to write up a determination that, it was a fair and reasonable price that was received, right? Because they have to be stewards of spending the taxpayer dollars. So, and just real quickly on this slide part about the way the Department of Defense is organized, you have kind of the Secretary of Defense, and everything falls under that. Secretary of Defense is at the highest level. But DCAA has to maintain, we are an audit organization. So, sometimes people get confused with, okay, well, DCMA is doing a review, or we have, the commands are doing some of their own reviews. The reviews are different. DCA, we have certain standards that we apply, which is called generally accepted government auditing standards. So we have certain steps because we're the organization that formulates actual audit opinions. And so we have to follow those steps to be able to formulate an opinion in our audit report. And and we get audited too to make sure we're adhering to the appropriate criteria, but we have to follow those auditing standards. And one of those say we maintain our independence. So from a reporting chain perspective, we report to the the Undersecretary of Defense at the Controller. You can see a lot of the other activities report straight up to their department, like the Air Force, the Navy. If we were aligned a different way, it could compromise, right? You could have pressure from up above to, okay, hang on, we need to do this, so maybe change that finding, et cetera. That's why it's very important we maintain our independence, and that's in line with the general accepted auditing standards, government auditing standards. So this is a slide back on our organization. So get these questions a lot from small businesses out there that inquire, hey, how do we find our office that is cognizant of our location or our company, if you will. And this is kind of this provides a little bit of insight into how we're set up. So you can think about it in terms of, we're set up with 3 different regions, Eastern, Central, Western. We do have a field detachment. They do classified, reviews and stuff of that nature. We also have major corporate audit directorates that were stood up, a few years back to kind of more align with who the government does major business with, right? All the major weapon systems out there that you hear on the news and stuff of that nature. So your Northrop Grumman's, Boeing, there's always a large contingency of auditors that sit in-house with those big major buyers, right? Those organizations. So this is how we're stood up. And basically, DCAA, like I said, remember the first slide, it's important to remember the term audit. Audit, we're at like 89% of our personnel are auditors. That's what we do. We have approximately about 4,000. I think one of these slides say a little bit higher, but that's what it was in 2022. And that's what we're focused on. When you deal with other organizations, they have many different functional areas that get involved. They may have engineers. They may have, a vast amount of legal teams, like if a company is going to protest an award, right, to get all the legal involved. They may have manufacturing experts, industrial specialists, program management, all these other things that different functional areas. But DCA's mission is to solely focus on audits, contract audits specifically. And then here's a little bit about kind of a map that kind of gives you the picture of the different, what the Western region covers, the Eastern and the Central region. And then it kind of, pinpoints where those corporate audit directorates at, where the major contractors are. But basically, if you're a small business, if you're a company somewhere, say you've never done business or you're looking to get into it, you may want to find out who your audit cognizant office is. Maybe you have to fill out paperwork on a, on a contract or some sort of form, something of that nature. And so you need to know. And so basically, let's say Texas, right, is on the map. So you have your company addresses in Texas, then you would know probably my cognizant office is in Texas. There are a few caveats to that, but that's usually applies to bigger companies. If you're stood up where you have a corporate ladder, right? So you have a corporation, you have divisions, and you're spread out. DCA pretty much, the cognizant office wants to sit where the company's books and records are. If you're a small business, it's probably just one small entity. So you'll have your books and records there, local. So typically your DCA office will be there, very close, somewhere within the vicinity, that they can come do a site visit, get books and records as necessary, et cetera. So let's see, if we go to So this is a quick snapshot of the of our public website. This contains a lot of good information. Maybe folks have visited it before, but this also, if you go to the locator tool at the top, you know, when you click on, I think it has the next slide. This is kind of what it brings up. So you can do your own research to try and find who your cognizant office is. Like, okay, what's your cage code? Sometimes you can put in, you know, the zip or the DUNS there, but sometimes when you do that, you know, if the cage code works, maybe it will identify one office, but sometimes when you put in the zip code, you may get 3 hits, right? And then you have no idea who would be your cognizant office. If that happens, like I said, just contact, you know, feel free to contact me. I'll, you know, have my contact information at the end here. You know, and I can help you locate who that would be to give you their, you know, their email, their office phone number, and, you know, identify exactly which office. You know, some of our offices are more voluminous and they have sub offices, mobile teams for small businesses, right? That can do visits. So I can definitely assist with that if you don't know who it is. And then quickly, the DCAA services we provide, if people aren't familiar, basically when the government goes to do an award, right, there's phases. There's the pre-award phase, where, you know, okay, they have to take into certain considerations on kind of what the need is, gather all the documentations, you know, what they're going to buy, how they're going to do that, et cetera, et cetera. So you have everything that occurs in that area up until the time of basically when you do the solicitation, and then you get it back and you actually examine the proposals, you try to decide, hey, who are we going to make the award to? All that's occurring in the pre-award phase, obviously, before you make the award. So our audit services on this slide just kind of tell you what we provide in the pre-award phase. Then actual contract award, you get into the post-award phase, which that's where the performance takes place. And that's basically contract administration, right? Oversight of the contract. Depending on what type of contract it is how much oversight you get. You know, firm fixed price usually is less administrative. If you have that type of structured contract, cost type, usually it's a little bit more intensive. So it really, you know, depends on several factors like that. But then you get into the end of performance and everything's finished, deliverable, the government got what it paid for, it got the service or the supply, everything's good. Now you have to close it out, make sure everything was taken care of. And DCAA can help with that in multiple ways. You know, with like a final voucher, making sure, you know, all the costs are aligned, et cetera. There are audits here that apply more to small business. If you're trying to get your accounting system, you know, reviewed, if you're going to get a cost type contract, for instance, or maybe you need some contract financing on a firm fixed price, and you're going to get progress payments that are based on cost. Usually those are trigger mechanisms where you would need to get an accounting system audit. And actually tomorrow, we're actually going to go more deeper into the accounting system and kind of how that functions and works and what we review on that nature. So I won't say much about it right now. Then we have our other services, incurred cost. That would more apply if you do have a cost type and you have to submit something at the end. Basically, if you think about it from this perspective, and you need to know what you're signing up for when you sign a contract, right? What terms, what clauses are in there that make you have to comply with something or submit something to the government. But if you think about it from this perspective, if you get a cost type contract, right? What you're supposed to bill to the government is your actual cost, right? Anything that's allowable, allocable, and reasonable, but your actuals, right? And so, but if you have overhead rates, okay, that apply, you don't know okay, say month one happens or month two, you know what your labor was last month, your labor costs were, and some other costs, direct costs, so you can bill that out. But your overheads, you don't know until the end of the year, right? And okay, is my rate going to be 10%? Is it 8%, 9%? So a lot of times we require the incurred cost submission if the appropriate clause is in the contract, because we have to review it at the end of the year to say, okay, is that rate a reflection of your actuals? And so that's kind of, so that can impact small businesses. Usually business system, not as much maybe of the accounting system, Typically, small businesses are exempt from, CAS standards, disclosure statements, stuff of that nature. So, and then, like what I'm going over today, this is also at our DCAA website. These are different briefings that we'll go around and do with different organizations that contact us. Basically, if you reach out, I'm happy to try and answer questions, maybe direct you to the right individuals as I can. But we don't provide, if industry reaches out to us directly, we don't provide any sort of direct training, direct presentations. We have training partners that we partner with, organizations like today, the Apex Accelerators, right, formerly PTAX. That's one of the main organizations that we do a lot of these presentations for across the U.S. Small business SBDCs, they'll invite us as well, the SBA, and then various other organizations that will kind of speak to, give folks kind of a little bit of background about DCAA, what we do, try to solicit feedback too when we can about what issues they may be struggling with, et cetera, and provide, guidance as we can. So here's a little bit about what we can provide. We're going to touch on Proposal Adequacy Day after this, and then tomorrow, obviously, we'll get into the accounting system requirements, which is the first bullet point there. And then here's our internet resources. I mentioned a couple of times. You can go to dca.mil. I highly recommend that. If you're going to be audited by DCAA, also just for good information, if you're, what can you glean from that, if you will, by looking at the information, some of the standards and things, because even if a contracting officer is not going to request our audit services, or maybe the contract doesn't meet certain thresholds, it's still good to get familiar with that information that is out there. So maybe you can provide a better proposal, right? Something more robust that will catch the attention of the buying command or the office that's actually trying to make the award, and you make your proposal a little bit stronger and better, right? Make it stand out a little bit. Say, hey, these folks really have their stuff together. Whether they've done business before or not, we can examine their proposal pretty easily and make our determinations, and we understand it. We think they understand the requirements, etc. So there's good guidance at the site to be able to go and look for stuff like that. There's checklists and tools out there. We'll talk about this a little bit in the next slide deck. Let's see. And then for the small business aspect, there's also the link on our public website, Small Business. You can go out there and click on that, and there'll be some frequently asked questions. Right now, the small business seminar section is not being maintained, as you know. Well, for those who don't know, there's been some transition lately. Like I said, right now I'm kind of acting in this role. We had somebody that left recently. So some of the stuff, the seminar stuff has not been updated in a long time. But all the other stuff is pretty current about the resources. We have slide decks out there, frequently asked questions, et cetera. And if you click on a couple of links, you can get to my contact information as well via email. So, and then here is my contact information. So, feel free to, like I said, reach out. There's a system too. You can do it. You have my email now directly. You can go to the website, and there's an email that you can email, and it will actually be routed to myself. Also on the phone, feel free to call it. Our VoIPs right now you can't leave a message. But like I said, if you need something, or I'm happy to try and answer some questions or direct you to the right place as I can. Just feel free to reach out. So with that said, before I move on to the proposal adequacy piece, are any questions or comments just kind of about DCAA in general, what we do, etc.?
We don't have anything in the chat, Adam, so you can proceed as you will.
Let me see. Okay, can you see my screen again, Beth?
I can.
Okay. Good. It's working a little smoother now, so that's good, right? That's always good. After a little bit of a rocky start, we get good, right? So
Yeah.
awesome. Okay. So basically, this kind of overview, training, etc. presentation is more or less kind of the elements of an adequate proposal. So, it begs the question here, okay, what is adequate? And that's kind of what we're going to get to in some of the slides. And basically it's more or less from a DCAA perspective. Like I said, if you go after an award out there, this posted on SAM or somewhere like that, you see a solicitation, a request for proposal, etc. It doesn't by no means always means DCAA is going to be involved. It's up to the contracting officer that's doing the evaluation. They wrote the requirements, etc. For the need that they have in unison with the folks that have the need, right? And so there's certain factors that they'll look at for those that are familiar with the process. You have like section L and M of the contracts, which are our uniform contract standards, if you will. That's basically, hey, here's the instructions on how you are supposed to respond to this request for your proposal. Here's the evaluation criteria we're going to utilize. But there's a lot of factors that are into play here. The threshold, right? Is it small? Is it under the simplified acquisition threshold of $250,000? So it depends on certain requirements. Are they going to do maybe a small business set aside if that's their strategy? Maybe there's capable small businesses out there of doing it. They're looking at the different socioeconomic programs, and there's different criteria for stuff of that nature. So they look at a lot of different things, but this slide presentation is more on the perspective of DCAA when we get involved, what triggers this, etc. And that's kind of how the background of this slide is written. So basically, what causes a proposal, right? So it's how the government does business, if you will. They do business through contracts, right? So I always think of it in terms like this. It's kind of funny if day to day, right? Let's say we all go to Walmart or we go to some store and we buy a product off the shelf, like some sort of radio, if you will. So when you buy that, right, you may shop around, you may Google online and say, hey, is this a decent price? What's the capability? What's the features of this radio, etc. But you feel pretty comfortable, right? It's out in the commercial marketplace. You can buy it. You can buy this brand. You can buy that brand. There's plenty of research, and you say, but usually, at least it never comes into my mind when I'm shopping that I, look at that radio and I say, what cost went into that to do it? So they're charging me, $50 for this radio, if you will, okay, or whatever component, basically. And okay, now how much labor costs did it take to do that? How much direct costs, what types of costs went into that? What are their margins? Did they do, are they getting like a 50% markup on this, etc.? So I don't think the average person thinks that way, right? Because it's commercial, it's really driven by supply, demand. Here's the pricing, not what went into it, and that's what people are willing to pay, right? If we weren't, then the prices would come down, right? They structure, and that's where you get competition. The government, in a lot of instances, is kind of disadvantaged because a lot of things we buy, especially in the Department of Defense, there's no commercial marketplace for it. There's unique items, etc. We do commercial buys as much as we can. It's highly encouraged, but there's a lot of unique things we buy that just so that's when we start looking at, hang on, so we can get on a fair footing with the companies and vendors that are supplying that. We need to kind of peel back the layer a little bit and see what kind of cost, etc. Everybody's heard the story of the government being charged like $5,000 for a hammer, basically, that went into some of the stuff. And so we just need to make sure we're stewards. And like I said, the contracting officers are tasked to make sure the prices are awarded are fair and reasonable. So, the government has done risk assessments. And so what's the threshold for getting all this data, et cetera, et cetera. But just a quick thing on the process here. So basically what leads up to this process is the agency has a need. It's a bona fide need. They need something. They need a supply. They need a service. They need to supply something to the men and women in the military, et cetera, right? So now they have to define what those requirements are, how they can satisfy it. And that's when you get into the solicitation, the development of a request for proposal, putting it out there, and the selection of sources, awards of contracts, and then you get into financing if it's needed, administration, et cetera, all the way up until closeout. Okay, this presentation mainly is going to focus on where there's negotiation involved. It's called FAR Part 15, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. You're getting into actual negotiations. It's not a simplified thing. It's not commercial items because there's caveats, et cetera. So I'll talk about this. Let's go on to the next slide here. And this is what I'm mentioning kind of about what we're talking about today. Price proposal adequacies, common deficiencies that we see when we do get involved in the audit process. Okay. And then we say, you don't have an adequate proposal because it lacks this and this and this. So adequate cost and pricing data, et cetera. So proposal adequacy here, the contractor, okay, itself, so the company, right, the entity, et cetera, is responsible for providing the adequate supporting data. So they have to, provide enough support, and that's kind of dictated a lot by the contracting officer makes that determination. How much information do I need to make this award at a fair and reasonable price, right? Sometimes it's a lot more, certain thresholds, the type of buy, the amount of the buy, et cetera. And so that's why, the adequacy piece, to make sure you have the information that's necessary. If you don't, it slows down the acquisition process. It can cause delays, et cetera, in making these buys. It can, people may have an urgent need to go buy this, right? Different buckets of money are involved, different people that have the need. So, it's important to make sure you do have an adequacy proposal to kind of help make sure that that process doesn't get slowed down, if you will, because this does cause a lot of delays when DCAA especially gets involved. And we're going to take a look at some checklists and other things that that go into this. But basically, what the government wants to do here is place reliant on the information. Now, we're going to get into a little bit of the checklists are talking about certified _ cost and pricing data. Okay, so cost and pricing data, we'll get into this a little bit, is like factual data. It's not judgmental data, or because proposals are estimates of future costs, right? But it's basically all the factual stuff that goes into supporting those types of estimates. Okay, but basically certified cost of pricing data, there was a new threshold now that requires it, if it's over $2 million, okay, the prime contract award is over $2 million, and basically, if it's over $2 million, it used to be $750K, but now they're adjusting it. It was $750,000 for a long time. They're kind of adjusting it based on risk and inflation and stuff of that nature. But if it's over but if an exception does not apply, so what's a couple of exceptions, and these are kind of spelled out in the regulation. One is adequate price competition, right? So if you can determine that there's competition, multiple vendors, you think about, again, like the commercial marketplace, there's usually a lot of competition, a lot of brands, et cetera, that can set the price. The government looks at that the same way. Is there competition that's going to say, hey, just by having that competition, we can actually determine and document, because contracting officers have to document why they said that was fair and reasonable, right? So the competition, a lot of people wanted to say the other, that's an exception. Other exception would be if it's commercial. Another exception if the prices are set by law or regulation, et cetera. So everybody's looking at, obviously, contractors, companies love when it's commercial, right? Because there's not as much scrutiny, there's not as much regulation involved. If there's price, if they can show there's adequate price competition, or a lot of people submitted bids and proposals, you can kind of look at that and say, okay, yeah, we have adequate price competition. We don't need all this other information. So there are exceptions to the rule, but if you do have over 2 million, 2 million an award, then basically you do have to submit certified cost of pricing data if there's no exceptions that apply. So what does certified mean? Okay, so you're basically signing up, okay, to say, I certify that this cost, again on the slide, at the bottom of the slide, is current, accurate, and complete. Okay, so what does that mean, and what issues can you run into on current, accurate, and complete? Well, basically, what is let's start with accurate, right? What does accurate mean? So if you get a quote from a vendor, okay, at like $80 for this part or something, okay, then when you're doing your cost build up and stuff like that, does it show that quote you received is $80, right? So it's kind of mathematically, okay, when you build your proposal and you're doing cost build up, you know, does what you show in the proposal, is it equal to the supporting documents via, if it was a quote or some other type of supporting document, that it adds up, right? It's the same cost. So that's what if something's accurate, that it shows, the data that you're using is kind of the same cost. And we'll look at that a little bit more. But like if you have indirect rates, that you're applying those correctly, mathematically, everything calculates and ticks and ties. That's kind of like the accuracy component of current, accurate, and complete. What about the complete component? Basically, when you're doing a proposal and you're saying, hey, this is what we're going to think we need to do together to get you that supply or that service, et cetera. So all the known facts that kind of affect that, is it all in there? Is it all in your proposal, that you know, hey, we got everything we need to be able to fulfill this requirement, et cetera. So you have the complete picture of everything. Is every vendor quote you received in there? So is your supporting documentation complete? You know, the technical proposal, if there is one. So you're saying you're going to perform some work. You know, is that in the price proposal? Stuff of that nature, and that gives you a complete picture of what you have. The tricky part on current, accurate, and complete sometimes, especially when it comes to certifying to whether your data is current, accurate, and complete, is current. Okay, so as you know, there's a time lag a lot of times when you submit a proposal. Okay, and now all of a sudden it may take time to have review. A lot of time passes, lags on. And then all of a sudden, okay, now you come, I got to certify because we're about to, you know, finalize the price. But because of that time, like maybe you went out and you got vendor quotes, and the vendor said, hey, or your supplier said, hey, these quotes are good for 30 days only, right? And then all of a sudden it takes you 60 days or 90 days. Now all of a sudden, oh, you can't certify because there might be a new price. So you would have to go back, and a lot of companies call it a sweep, look through all that data to make sure it is current, accurate, and complete. So you kind of have to be cautious on the current part here, because that can definitely change right before you go to certify. And the implication when somebody signs to certify this current, accurate, and complete, you can have what's called defective pricing, right? If the government relied on that information and it was significant, you get what's called the rule that's truthful negotiations, truth and price negotiations. They call it TINA now a lot of times. I think in the US code it says it a little bit differently now, but basically that you were truthful with all this data. If it's found out because there's an audit opened up that says, oh, we think it wasn't, we relied on something that really impacted the price and it wasn't current, accurate, and complete. You know, say for instance, you had some vendor quotes and you put them in your proposal, but you know, based on history, you're going to be able to negotiate the price down with the supplier because you have the history of doing that, and you don't include that information, or you're going to get some discount for the supplier. Okay, that's the government then relied on something that wasn't current, accurate, and complete. You didn't disclose that information that could impact the pricing of that. So basically that kind of gives you a picture of current, accurate, complete and what you're signing up to do when that kicks into play, and that will, the certified cost and pricing data, that will be definitely spelled out in your, in the proposal, in the request for proposal, et cetera, whether it's going to be subject to that. So this gets into the checklist. If you remember the DCAA site that I talked about earlier, the public website, we published a checklist under 15-2. You still can probably find some old versions out there, but I don't think it's up to date. If you look at our website, it says, yeah, we no longer keep that checklist up to date and published because the DFARs, which is the supplement to the regulations, the federal acquisition regulations, basically has a proposal adequacy checklist out there. And it's encouraged when certified costing pricing data is going to apply, that contracting officers put this clause in the contract. And basically this checklist is supposed to be filled out by the contractor to make sure they have everything in their proposal. And I will, let me see if I can do this without messing things up here too much. Going to share. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see my screen again.
We got the checklist. We're good.
Okay, so this is a little bit different. Actually, this had to do with Lockheed Martin. I put some stuff together, but this is all the. This is a little bit more robust, but this is all the components in FAR Part 15, Table 15-2, to say, hey, is everything in that's being required in the regulation, right? Do we have it in our proposal, and do we have it structured the right way? That's what gets a little bit tricky. That's why, you get into these things where DCAA gets involved, because we've been requesting to review that proposal, and it's a negotiated proposal. It required certified cost and pricing data. So the first thing DCAA is going to do is take the checklist and say, okay, do I have all the information I need to conduct the audit? Is everything there? So when you have this checklist, I'm going to show a couple of examples. You can kind of go through it, and it references here where it talks about this in the regulation. So checklists like this are nice because it's a little bit more robust than what's in the FAR. But basically, it's kind of simple in some regards. You need to also include a lot of referencing to the different parts. Some of the proposals can get pretty big. Okay, so here's where we're answering this item on this checklist that we have it. Now, where is it located, right? What's the numbering sequence? What's the indexing sequence? So I'll show you an example of a couple of these, and I just highlighted a couple. Like, for instance, okay, let me see. Is this the right? Is that what I wanted to show? Okay, so I jumped ahead of myself. Forgive me here. I highlighted a couple of these. Okay, so like this one, very generic, and it just gives you an idea, right? So basically has the offer provided the following information on the first page of the pricing proposal, right? So it lists 11 items here, right, that you need to have and what you need. I'm going to show you that in a second, right? So as we scroll along here, all these different items, like I highlighted a couple areas, like if more than one contract line item is proposed, right? So a lot of times, because of the way we're supposed to structure our contracts, or contract officers are when they actually write a contract, right? And the solicitation as well is a CLIN. Maybe people are familiar with a CLIN, a contract line item number. So things are structured by CLINs. You can have SLINs and ACRAs. That's beyond the scope of the discussion today. But that's what it means by the contract line item is proposed. Then you break down the cost on that line item that you're proposing to. So like, for instance, in section B of the solicitation, it says here's CLIN 001. Here's what we need on this CLIN. Okay, how do you propose to that? So it's wanting a breakdown. I'll show an example of that. But that's another thing. And I think I had one other thing highlighted. I was just going to show you. Okay, does the proposal include a time phased breakdown of the labor hours, the rates and costs, the skill levels, et cetera? What are the basis of estimates and stuff like that? So this just kind of gives you, I'm just highlighting a couple of areas. This is under a direct labor piece of the checklist. And so now, how do you fulfill that criteria that is being asked of you, right? So I'm going to, let me see, stop share. I like to share my screen a lot here. Let me see. Okay, so I'm not too familiar with why Zoom is not bringing up. Okay. Okay. That took a quick second. Sorry about that. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen again. And basically, again, this is very good information, okay, overall, but I want to reference this because, you know, the slide deck that we have really doesn't, I'm a big example person, right? I like to see, visualize what someone's talking about, what they mean by something in the checklist, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, this just, you know, this provides a little bit of background on, you know, the table 15.2 and the reason over, if it's over 2 million now after 2018, okay, you know, it's going to require cost and pricing data, certified cost and pricing data if an exception doesn't apply. So basically, back to the checklist that I showed you, what I wanted, because I'm going to reference this many times. So for instance, how do you fulfill that checklist? Here's a great example, okay? So it's asking for the cover sheet to be 11 things, right? So here's a great example. Okay, here's the contract number. Here's the address, point of contact, right? Number 8 wants to know, are you subject to cost accounting standards? Okay, so is your company, you know, subject to those? Basically 9, there's a statement there that you certify, then someone who can bind the company has to sign that, right? So this is a great example of, okay, you see this checklist, what do I have to do? Okay, this is how you start kind of putting 2 and 2 together to fulfill those steps, right? The other thing I referenced that's really good, because I was going to refer back to this a little bit, is basically, let me scroll down here. This kind of gives you a good snapshot of, so what I mentioned before, some contracts, you know, when they submit, when the government submits this request for proposal, it's done by CLIN, right? So you have to propose on what's this CLIN. So here's a great example. Okay, this is CLIN 001, and they're wanting the program management here. That's the cost element they're looking at, okay? So remember on one of the checklists, okay, it wants a time phase of the labor hours that go into that. Well, here's a great example. So if you see down here, okay, under the scope, where you see the time phase breakdown of hours. So you see on that CLIN, usually there'll be a period of performance, right? This actually runs for 1 year, right? On the CLIN, the period of performance goes from January to December. Okay, so here's how you time phase the labor. So the labor costs that go into fulfilling that program management requirement, okay, in January, 462 hours. As a matter of fact, this is just kind of straight line, but here's all the hours, here's the time phasing of the hours that go into that. So you have a breakdown of that, and then, you know, people can further look in and dive a little bit deeper in those hours if you need to. But that's kind of just to give you a picture of how you fulfill things on the checklist, right? That we can go through. So basically, okay, so let me get out of this really quick. Okay, this is an easier way to do it now. Okay, so back to the slide deck. And I'm going to go through these a little bit on the proposal cost elements as I referenced the sheet. It won't take too long to give you a quick example, but basically on the proposal adequacy piece, I want to go back. One thing I forgot to mention here is an estimating system. So a lot of times if you have certified, I know we're going to talk accounting system tomorrow, but if it requires certified cost or pricing data, the estimating system clause, and it can be, it's not applicable. Every piece of that clause is not applicable to all small business, but it's a really good clause to be familiar with on what's an acceptable estimating system, right? So the big key word is being consistent in your proposals, but is the system that you kind of maintain to do your estimates, right? A system is usually, software, data, policies and procedures, et cetera, but is it maintained? Is it reliable? Is it consistently applied? Does it produce, so the documents that come from your system and your software, is it verifiable, supportable, documented? Can it produce timely cost estimates? Is it consistent with any sort of interoperable management systems, right? So basically an acceptable system provides for the use of appropriate source data, it utilizes sound estimating techniques, good judgment, and you maintain a consistent approach, and that you adhere to any sort of established policies and procedures that you've developed to formulate good estimates. So I did want to quickly mention that. Basically, and I'll quickly go over these proposal cost elements as I bring up a different slide. But basically, direct labor, material, subs, other direct costs, indirect rates. That's a lot of the components of the cost elements on all these proposals that, when we require certified cost and pricing data, that we need broken down, that we're going to kind of peel back the hood a little bit and look into deeper how the estimates were built up, et cetera. I'll talk a little bit more about that, et cetera. And I already talked about time phasing. So I'm going to show you, this is kind of the direct labor piece of it with escalation factors, et cetera. Material should include a consolidated summary of individual material quantities. So you may have a consolidated bill of materials and break that down. I'm going to show you a quick example of that. Price competition, this gets back to what we were talking about earlier. Okay, there's a lot of times where everybody wants to claim price competition because it alleviates you from certain rules and regulations that apply, right? But just because somebody claims it doesn't make it true, right? That there was appropriate price competition so that other rules wouldn't apply. So that's something to watch out for. You just want to make sure that, if you are competing vendor quotes or something, that you have that documentation readily available that shows, hey, no, we did a thorough price competition. That's what drove our reasonable price, et cetera, et cetera. But contracting officers may require cost of pricing data, which would be certified, right? But as I mentioned off the top, all contracting officers have to make a fair and reasonable determination of price. So a lot of times, maybe if it doesn't require to be certified, it would be kind of considered uncertified. It's other than cost of pricing data. What is that? It could be the same thing as certified cost of pricing data, except that it's uncertified, right? So it may need to be the same level of detail. A lot of times it's directed to the contract officers to not, get as little detail as possible in those instances, that you can actually make a good, accurate determination on fair and reasonableness, right? So that's kind of the caveat there. It depends on how deep someone's going to look at this. Subcontracts, that's a real point of contention in reviews a lot of times. Sometimes if you're a prime and you have vendors, you have subs you're going to do business with, et cetera, maybe there's times where, hey, you don't have the visibility. Maybe it's proprietary information or something. They don't want to share all the necessary information. It's still required where you're going to propose subcontractors in your proposal that you do some sort of cost price analysis that documents that you as the prime, because you have premium contract with any sort of subcontractors and suppliers, that the cost that you're going to be invoiced from the prime, right? That they are fair and they are reasonable, et cetera, because the government will definitely look at that. And there's other caveats on subcontracts that if you don't have access to certain things, you can always request from the cognizant contracting officer that you need help. And, depending on the thresholds and things, DCAA can actually, obviously go in and look at the subcontract records and stuff of that nature and assist with that process. So that's definitely something to look out for, because this is a point of contention a lot of times on, hey, we find things to be inadequate because, there's no good price cost information on the vendors and suppliers, et cetera. So that's definitely something to watch out for. And here's some examples of when the analysis procedures that are utilized would cause that a company utilized would cause your proposal to be inadequate, right? So these are some things: failure to perform commercial item determination, okay, failure to support the degree of competition on when you have these vendors and stuff of that information. So that's something to definitely watch out for. And on the subcontract analysis, it helps to make the process smoother, go quickly, reduce audit support, timely. But a lot of the inadequate analysis can be where there's unsupported costs, right? So there's no documentation, there's no analysis done that supports what those costs are that are being proposed. You can get into adverse audit opinions, which you don't really want. Something's material and pervasive, so therefore, hey, it's bad, right? It's bad. So that's about the worst audit opinion that can be given. And it can cause delays, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to have a good analysis. So I want to, let's see, I'm going to skip this piece here. And this talks about other direct costs and vendor quotes. So I'm going to lump all these together: indirect costs, et cetera. So I'm going to go back, because I want to show a couple of examples really quickly here. Let's see. Hopefully everyone can see my screen again, if that'll go away. So here's some really good examples. And again, I'm a visual person, right? So I showed you some of this, but so I, kind of talking through the slides, I'm going to kind of show you, hopefully it makes a little bit more impact on a couple of good examples here. Indexing is very important on your proposal. What does that mean? Okay, so like here's a good example of the index of certified cost of pricing data. Okay, the description, right? They're using historical actuals for their labor, right? So they may use actuals that they have, and then they're going to apply escalation or something like that. But it tells you, is it included in your proposal, right? That's what it's supposed to do. What cost element does that support? Well, obviously direct labor. And then where is it in the volume, right? Okay, well, it's in Appendix A. Here's my labor. So this is a good part to fulfill. Okay, this is how we index a proposal, because these are things when DCAA gets something, right? If they're going to do an audit, where is the information, right? They're not familiar with your proposal. I mean, especially like the buying offices, they may get, 5, 10 different proposals on this section. Everybody's structures there, and this provides some consistency on where's the data, how do I know that what I'm looking at, who needs to look at it, et cetera, right? Because there can be a lot of different functional people involved. Cost element breakdown, I'll show a quick example of that, but labor, material, other direct costs, G&A, kind of breaking that down as to how they were calculated. Here's a really good example too on like, for instance, like a part, right? So you have a part 1 here, and it's going to be over 2 years, right? So you have your hours, you have what your rate is, your overhead applied. So this is like a good detailed cost buildup, level of effort, materials, ODCs, et cetera. So you kind of show the buildup, and that shows 2021. And then the next part is a buildup of 2022. And then you have the summary, right? So these are some things that are asked for in that checklist. Obviously, things may not be, as complicated as this. There's a section about forward pricing rate agreements. If you have those with the government already, you're going to use that as a base. Maybe some of a company's rates have already been negotiated. Okay, you reference that, right? Okay, here's the date of the agreement, et cetera. This is what we're utilizing in our proposal. Okay, material. Okay, I talked about consolidated bill of materials in the checklist as a part of all that. Okay, so basically consolidated bill of materials. So you can see below it, there's a bill of materials for part Y and part X that's broken down, right, as to everything that needs to go into part Y and part X. But consolidated just means, okay, everything together, all the parts that go in everything overall. So there's a good, easy picture to see, okay, how many parts are being used, what's the price, what might we need to look at, et cetera, before we get more into the detailed breakdown of that. Okay, material, and I'll mention this a little bit more, but there's 5 different elements of a consolidated bill of materials. You need the item part number, the quantity, the source, cost basis, et cetera. And then basically, let's see, here's a good example, and I'll show you a quick live example of this in a second, of cost price analysis, what went into the determination, right? So we've been talking about what's your analysis of your pricing, right? That you determined that, hey, I can submit this, it looks good, it was based on something. So for instance, on this, right, you have these different types of products. What type of analysis did you perform on those, right? Especially if it's some sort of supplier. So you say, okay, was it competitive bids? Was it commercial item determination, right? So therefore you don't need the extra cost and pricing data. Did you do your own cost price, certified cost price analysis, documentation, et cetera? So, that's a good picture of, okay, now how did I support that cost? And I'll show you a little bit better example of that in 1 second. Here's a good example of a consolidated bill of materials. And actually it has it right here, row 4 there. What's the source of that, right? So there's a quote. Sometimes large contractors will have long-term agreements. That's what LTA means there, with suppliers, right? That a lot of times that doesn't apply to small businesses, but maybe it was based on that long-term agreement. Purchase order history, right? Is the purchase order relevant enough? Did things change, right? You need to, so purchase order history can be used, but it can't be too well, it still has to be relevant, still has to be current, et cetera. So, you need to kind of speak to, hey, why is this purchase order history a good item that supports these costs, et cetera, right? So that's a really good breakdown. Direct labor rates, the same thing. So there's a couple of slides that talk about indirect labor rates, breaking them down. What type of labor do you need to fulfill the requirement, right, that you're soliciting a bid on, right, or that you might receive an award on? What type of labor classifications are going to go into it? So you can see, like on these slides, okay, they're going to need a program manager, a senior engineer, engineer 2, engineer 1. Here's the different labor rates for them across different years, right, that are going to be reflected, because there's usually, if you read at the bottom there, there's escalation, right? So maybe it was 74.93. Maybe if you're doing a takeoff from your actuals, now you're going to escalate that by 3%. So this is where we get into cost or pricing data, right? The $74.93 there, if that was actually what you paid last year, that's good factual cost and pricing data that can be verified. And now the judgmental piece is, what's that going to look like going forward? Based on, did we give bonuses, payouts, et cetera? What's the escalation? If we're gonna pay them a little bit more money, et cetera, based on something. So the judgmental component of that would be, okay, here's the factor we utilize, but hey, we're using some sort of survey or some sort of global insights a lot of times, for that different area of work, right? This is what we think the escalation is going to look like. So really the government's just trying to find out, how did you do this? What did you utilize? What did you base it on here? So is it good, accurate? And then back to the labor classifications, the mix here. So if we're paying for an engineer 2, okay, are we truly getting an engineer 2? So if we're paying for an engineer 2, what descriptions make up an engineer 2 that you're going to need? So the government may look at, well, hey, we're paying for this, but you're giving us a trainee or an engineer 1. Okay, hang on. Why are we paying for something that's more than what we need, or we actually needed this and we said, and that's what we're paying for, but you're doing something less. So that's really important. And the other thing is important here is, if you have average labor rates, what's the mix of that going to be, et cetera. So, basically, but anyway, we talked about time phasing a little bit, basis of estimates, and the cleanse structure a little bit here. So anyway, this is a lot of good information. I do want to mention, I want to change this real quickly to, hopefully it's up here. Okay, that was easier than before. Okay, so I was just going to mention this. This is, again, getting back to the checklist and how you would propose something. Here's a really good example of a bill of material. Okay, here's the part, right? This is not the consolidated piece yet. How did you get to that, right? Okay, we did a quote for this part. That's what our justification was. Long-term agreement, purchase order history, so what did you utilize to say that cost is reasonable? What type of analysis? So consolidated would just roll all that up. And we talked about that. Other direct costs, this is always important from a travel perspective, right? If you're doing, okay, if you're sending people to somewhere, because there's requirements that necessary travel, right, to fulfill the requirements of the contract. We want specific things like, what's the destination, what's the purpose of the trip. This is in accordance with the travel code. What's the destination? How many days? How many people are going? Okay, the lodging, the airfare, the rental, the meals, etc. What's that breakdown to say, hey, were those fair? What's the basis of the airfare cost, right? Was that reasonable? Are you flying first class, right, etc. Something like that. The lodging, what's that based on? Certain per diem rates out there, etc. What's the basis to say, hey, this is what a prudent person would spend when they go on these trips, right? But that's different breakdown. There's some labor hour breakdowns. But I was going to show you one thing real quick. So in the FAR, like if you get back to the CLINs, it requires a chart like this on each CLIN. So if you're proposing cost on CLIN 001 in my example, what are all the cost elements that went into that total cost that you're proposing? So the FAR checklist requires that breakdown of, okay, here's everything and here's the total, right? If unit cost applies, maybe not. And then it wants you to reference it too. So in this case, you can see here, 10,812, and it references level of effort, labor here, right? So then it's real quickly, you can go back to, let's see, I think it's right here. Okay, so you can see, okay, here's the level of effort, labor, and now it has the nice breakdown, okay, by, the years, etc., 2018, 2019, and there's your total, right? So this is kind of the cost buildup. Sometimes in parts, it wants the summary, but it wants you to be able to reference to find the detailed buildup. And then above that, you have to have the basis of estimates, which is a description of what's the methodology that you use or the assumptions that you use to say, this is a good cost, like a survey for labor, some sort of indexing for escalation, et cetera, right? It's just kind of explaining that. So that's really a lot of things DCAA is looking for, in these types of proposals. And obviously they can be very complex, large volumes, or it can be more simple. But I mean, I think this kind of provides a good basis for kind of having a picture in your mind of what the government's going to be looking for, looking at the different types of breakdowns and builds up, et cetera. So I've already talked to a lot of these. We don't like it when you straight line costs in the eye. So if you have a rate that says, okay, it's 10% here, 5% here, now it's 9%. Now for the last 3 years, if a contract's going to run multiple years, we're just going to flatline it because we only built up our budget here. We don't have a future budget yet. Well, you still have to make, not that maybe your rate's going to stay similar. You still have to provide documentation to say, okay, this is why we don't think our budget's going to change. Everything's going to be the same. You got to disclose what assumptions you're making, et cetera, to provide a really good foundation. You can't just say, hey, we did it for year one here, and now we're going to give you the same thing for the next 2 years. No, we don't accept stuff like that. You have to say why, what are the assumptions, et cetera. So that's a little bit about flatlining, the way you build up your budget when you're trying to budget your company on, hey, here, what's going to be my cost of goods sold, et cetera, to come up with your budget. Sales is important. We do a lot of trend analysis, right, versus history based on sales. How's the cost going to correlate to those sales, et cetera. But when we have inadequate data, we say it's not adequate, it just causes more difficulty in negotiations, delays, bad audit opinions, lengthy audits, et cetera, like that. So that's a quick example of straight line. Improvements to consider, different trends. Always look at your fixed costs, your variable costs, semi-variable costs, upcoming changes, right, that you're taking in consideration for your future cost estimates as you develop that budgetary data, like what may change, right? If you have learning curves, are you getting better and more efficient? So now it's going to cost less. You're able to produce goods, or even services at a less cost. You can do them faster, quicker, et cetera, because of the experience you gain. So again, the cost of pricing data, I've mentioned this, is factual, verifiable, et cetera, includes data that informing the basis for a judgment, not the judgment itself, but the basis of forming that. Definition requirements, cost and pricing data. There's some references for the FAR, et cetera. Here's an example of cost or pricing data, vendor quotes, as I mentioned multiple times, POs, make or buy decisions, better to make it in-house, better to, so if you have that type of documentation to say, here's our determination why we can, outsource it cheaper than we can, or buy it cheaper than we can make it in-house, et cetera. Those are good examples of cost pricing data. And, these are some issues you run into, delays with the audit process, et cetera. I'm going to skip the little question here. Improvements to consider when the purchase order is verifiable and is not current. Okay, so consider the following, right? So again, I mentioned this before. If you have a little bit of an older PO, you may need to do some updates to it. You can't just say, oh, it's still good, it's still valid. Okay, well, hang on, it's a quantity change. Can you get more current competitive quotes? Those are things that DCAA and the government would be looking for. Labor, I went over labor a lot, but these are some issues you can have. Historical data, did you use it, not use it? Escalation, again, what was your basis? Did you index it? Benchmarking, surveys, et cetera. Improvement curves, are you getting better? So those are things they consider. Indirect rates, having internal budgets, et cetera. And I know we're running a little short on time. I was going to show you a little bit, a piece about indirect rates, but anyway, basically indirect rates, you have your expenses, your base allocation factors, but what are the budgets to say, here's going to be all my overhead, right? Here's going to be my indirect labor. And, this a little out of the scope of to get too deep on this topic of indirect rates versus direct rates, what does that mean, et cetera. I think we have some other presentations that talk a little bit more deep into stuff like that. But do you have ongoing issues you need to disclose? Just for instance, when you sign that certified cost and pricing data, is your company subject to CAS, et cetera, and you have to disclose that. Again, here's historical data. Are you repeating one-time costs, right? Non-recurring that only happened once. Now you're still proposing that forward because you didn't take it out, but it only happened one time. Watching out for stuff like that is very important. That's stuff we see. FAR 31 talks about allowable costs. You'll hear that a lot by DCAA when they question costs in their audit reports, basically saying that's not allowable. Here's some reasons why they might, you didn't follow your general accepting or the GAP, the general accepting accounting principles. Maybe it violated the section of FAR Part 31. Maybe you try to charge alcohol or something. Well, that's expressly unallowable. Was the cost reasonable? If it's not reasonable, it's unallowable. What did you not adhere to a term of the contract? Was the cost not allocable? So it doesn't apply to that contract at all. Okay, CAS if it applies, et cetera. So common deficiencies, inadequate cost or pricing data, lack of inadequate budgetary data. We kind of talked about this. And again, one of the big ones that I emphasized before, failure to really analyze your subs and suppliers. So these are some things, obviously we went over this, that pricing proposals should include. Here's some resources that you can also look at. Like I said, there's really good information at the DCAA public website, but obviously you can find the DFARs proposal adequacy checklist that we talked about. You can find, the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. You got to be familiar with that if you're going to do federal contracting or go after those awards. It really behooves you to be familiar because those clauses are going to be incorporated in your contract, the ones that apply. And then there's our public website. So I kind of rushed through the last piece because I know we got a bit of a delayed start. We had some technological issues, but we kind of got through it quickly. So, but with that, I'll just say, hey, any comments or questions?
We have a question in the chat, Adam. Claudia asks, is the CMMC implementation expense an indirect cost? She believes that it's allowable, but wants to know if that's a direct or indirect cost.
So I can't tell you if it's, if something like the way you set up your company is something's going to be automatically a direct cost or an indirect cost. What I can describe to you is, the description of what a direct cost is versus an indirect cost. And it all has to do with traceability, right? So if you're charging a direct cost to a contract, right? So you have, let's say you have contract A, B, and C, because let's look at a contract as being your final cost objective, right? So you got contract A that you're going to be charging, contract B. Obviously the labor, right? When an employee fills out their timesheet and they're identify, okay, I'm working this task, it's going on contract A, it's traceable to that, it's direct cost. so it can be identified and it can be traced to one final cost objective. That's direct costs, right? So, and there are some caveats to this, but this is just a generic overview. Indirect costs would be more something like, maybe supervision, that you're overseeing people that are working, but they're charging time to different contracts, et cetera. So you need to allocate your time, over those multiple cost objectives. But as far as when you get into, is a specific type of cost, I mean, there's a lot of layers to that question to say, in other direct costs, would this be more classified as direct? Would it be, there's a lot of I can't just say, yes, that type of cost, the CMMC is definitely a direct cost, or it's definitely not a direct cost. There would be more layers to that question, because we actually have contract. I would say be consistent for sure how you treat it, right? Follow the definitions like I'm describing on the basic definitions of direct, indirect. But what I mean is there is some caveats, right? So even though maybe a screw or a nut or a bolt can be traceable to a degree to one specific contract, because you're using across many different ones, it may be impractical, right? So there's some caveats and leeway that says, okay, you can kind of set those up as indirect and allocate it across all, but the contractor needs to be consistent. And especially if the CAS standards comply, they have to actually write a detailed disclosure statement. And I would recommend you take a look at that. Even if it doesn't apply, you can find an example online to say, how are you going to treat that cost, right? And that's your disclosure statement. Okay, this type of cost comes up. Am I going to treat it as a direct cost? Am I going to treat it as an indirect cost? So you're disclosing to the government, and you can have these in your policies and procedures, and they know going into it, this is how this company is going to treat this cost. So this is how we know how they're handling it, right? But I can't, if folks start naming, okay, hey, this cost A, tell me if that's direct or indirect. I can't do that. It's like there's more, again, I don't know the build up to traceability to say, okay, can you trace that directly to that final cost objective? Then yes, it would be more direct, right? You can account for it. And, theoretically, you could almost account for all costs as direct, right? But it's not practical, right? You can't, a supervisor that's overseeing, or somebody, a corporate up to the very top of some corporation, could you potentially say, okay, this day, Monday, he spent, a 2/10 of an hour handling this? Well, of course, if you wanted to have someone spend all your time doing it, but it's not practical. So there's rules and things where, okay, how do you trace that? How do you set it up? And how can it be, how is it allocated to contracts? How do we treat that cost? And so, it's very important to be consistent. So I don't know, again, hopefully that answers the question a little bit, but it's hard to say, hey, this cost is direct and this cost is indirect, just, verbatim. So.
Okay, that was the only question that we had in the chat. Does anyone else have a question to pose to Adam at this time? Quiet crowd today.
Right.
Again, we will be sharing these slides in which Adam's contact information is present. If anyone has any questions when we get off there and you're like, oh, I really wish I would have asked that. Adam, I'm sure they can reach out to you directly on your email, and you'll be able to help them out with any questions they may have.
Sure, absolutely.
And if you have not already, please know that tomorrow's partner webinar, Accounting System Requirements in Government Contracting, will be held tomorrow at 10 a.m. There is a link in the chat for you to sign up. If not, you may do so through our website, which is ptac-southeastpa.org. And other than that, we thank you all for coming and for bearing with us through our technical difficulties. We hope to see you tomorrow. Have a wonderful day.